This is Ramon, channel is Alpha 4, and welcome to my commentary on the Apostate Prophet versus Nadir Ahmed debate on whether or not the Quran has errors, or at least scientific errors. The Apostate Prophet Nadir Ahmed debate. It was hosted over on the Amin Ra channel, and he also moderated. I'm very impressed with how Amin Ra moderated. Rarely did he get involved and really kept both guys on track. Now, a few times toward the end, some of his anti-theist bias started showing. I want to talk about a few things. Normally when I do these kind of videos, I just play the parts that I'd want to talk about and then kind of comment about them, and I kind of do a commentary on the debate. There's not really any material to really do that in this debate, and that's part of the problem with this debate. So let's break it down from the beginning. Apostate Prophet is a YouTube atheist. He used to be part of the anti-theist community at the very beginning of his channel, but then quickly developed into a really strong anti-Quranic, I would say, apologist. This stuff is actually really interesting. It kind of goes along with the David Wood stuff. So for a long time, when him and David Wood were not part of the same group, you kind of watch their channels back and forth and kind of get kind of an idea of what both sides are trying to say. Now he's kind of in the David Wood camp, so now it's kind of like an echo feedback, but that's fine. When it comes to Nadir, I don't know anything about it. I actually started following or listening to the Apostate Prophet back when he only had like 5 or 6 viewers. I really liked his channel back then, and my channel was also starting at the same time, so I was hoping that we would grow around the same speed and maybe one day I could have a conversation with him. Obviously his channel took off and mine did not. Mine had the opportunity to, especially when I got deep into the Quranic studies, and then with my new job I just don't have enough time to go through the Quran the way that it would have to be gone through. But that being said, I have read the Quran, I have read the Bible. I am a Catholic, I'm not an atheist. I am a Christian, so that's where I'm coming from. And when it comes to the debate, in my opinion, Nadir lost, but it's not because the apostate prophet defeated him. It's simply because Nadir destroyed his own arguments and really came off as a jerk. I've seen several Muslim-Christian debates, Muslim versus Christian. It usually gets kind of ugly, and usually the Muslim apologist is usually the one who ends up being a jerk and coming off as just kind of uncouth, which is unfortunate. And it ends up making the other side look like the winner, even if they didn't have great points. The Apostate Prophet didn't have a lot of strong points to make, and he really didn't seem very seasoned, which is the problem with the Apostate Prophet's counters. He was mostly just letting Nadir make a fool of himself and then taking a lot of abuse from Nadir. And that was really unfortunate and really nasty and condescending on Nadir's part. So let's break it down. What are the talking points here? So let's talk about the Apostate Prophet's talking points first, because they are the fewest. He said the fewest things, but he said the strongest things, which was that there are errors inside the Quran, scientific errors, that kind of stuff. When I was reading the Quran, though I did notice those same scientific errors, if you want to call it that way, I wasn't reading the Quran that way. I was enjoying the Quran as a work of poetry, type of cyclic poetry, I think is what it's called, where the lines kind of circular and then they repeat, and so different parts of the poem interact with other parts of the epic poem, and it's not a direct narrative. So that is actually really cool. So when you're not taking the Quran literally, you're taking it as poetry, it's actually quite enjoyable. And in the Arabic, which yes, I've heard it in the Arabic, it is very beautiful to hear. I think Homer's The Iliad And the Odyssey is actually a little bit nicer. But I think a lot of the epic poetry, like the Prose Edda and the Elder Edda, are more interesting. Even the Bible is actually poetry. It's actually supposed to be sung. A lot of people don't know that. One of the things that I didn't enjoy about it is that the people who were interpreting the Quran were taking it 100% literal. So the stuff that I was enjoying as metaphor, they were taking it as literal. And because they don't allow for that metaphor to happen, or because it has to be a miracle, or because it has to be the best version of whatever, of poetry, of whatever, it takes a lot of the joy and the pleasure out of reading the Quran. Having people comment and take away the metaphor and take away the analogies and the poetry and taking it as strictly literal and only keeping it on a very surface level meaning takes out a lot of the pleasure from the Quran. The other part that I didn't enjoy about it is that it denies a lot of known history and denies a lot of Christology. So both known history that I happen to enjoy because I happen to like ancient history, and a lot of Christology and even a lot of philosophy. The Quran goes against a lot of Western philosophy and a lot of Western theology. And so for those three reasons, the Quran can become kind of a slog to get through because the poetry that it's going through is very repetitive. And the ideas of it are very much against Western ideas, whether they be moralistic ideas or whether they be historic understandings of history and how events unfolded. And there's Nadir's problems. So Nadir's problem comes to the Quran, seems to be the Bible, which was very disappointing. So first he complains about the metaphor of the mustard seed. So I actually have some mustard seeds. So hold on. This is, I don't know if you can see it, that's a mustard seed. It's a very, very tiny thing. Okay? The metaphor there is that it's the smallest of seeds becomes one of the biggest of plants. First off, it doesn't become the biggest of plants. Secondly, it's not the smallest seed in the world, but it is a very small seed, and the plant that grows from it is much bigger than the seed itself. Metaphor very easy to understand, and that's part of the problem that Nadir has, is that anything in the Quran that's clearly metaphorical, he's going to call it a miracle. And anything in the Quran that can be understood as both literal or metaphor, he's going to say is 100% literal. And he's going to tie it into science, which doesn't make a lot of sense because science itself changes rapidly. So what is true in science today might not be true in science tomorrow. His idea that somehow the Quran 100% agrees with science is semi-ludicrous because science doesn't 100% agree with science. You're always testing hypotheses. You're always going through the theories. That's why it's not called scientific fact, it's called scientific theory. It's because even when it's to the point that 99.999% of scientists agree, there's going to be one scientist that's going to say, well, maybe not. So, in trying to prove something that you weren't actually there to witness, it's really hard to do, and inconsistencies in testing, and sometimes variables that are unknown variables. There's a whole lot of stuff. Part of Nadir's problem is trying to tie it into today's science. Well, then what happens to the Quran back in the Middle Ages when science said very different things? Or science in the 1940s? Or science maybe 100 years from now, when the science is going to have new discoveries? Is the stuff that the Quran says is correct today, if it's disproven in the future, then what's the answer going to be? Are you going to say you're misinterpreting the Quran currently, and therefore it has to tie into whatever the future science says? Or are you going to say that the future science is incorrect and only the modern science or the current science is the correct one? You see the problem? Another problem that Nadir had is that he got stuck on several passages and several words, so he got stuck on translations. I happen to read a lot of translations. I happen to have over 20 translations of the Bible. All of them say roughly the same thing, by the way. And I happen to have 3 print translations of the Quran, and all of them say roughly the same thing. So his whole thing that, oh, they don't match up, no, they pretty much match up. To say that you can't understand what something's saying because it's a translation is just false. I read plenty of ancient Greek, ancient Roman, and ancient Babylonian, and Sumerian, and ancient, I even now have some ancient Chinese texts, thanks to my wife. So thank you, wife. And these things are just, they're easy to understand. Translation doesn't make something so mysterious you can't understand. Also, he denies a lot of the history of the Quran that most Quranic scholars agree on. For instance, I have the Harper 1 Quran that goes through the process that the Quran went through to become the work that it is today. It actually had a process. Talks about how it lost some information because the prophet died and there was a battle and whatever. And there were several versions of the Quran in the original Arabic, and there's only one official version. And it just goes through all that kind of stuff. The way that he speaks is acting as if the Western audience doesn't have any context for the history of the Quran, which we do. We don't know a lot about the culture, but we can find out a lot about the history because there's a lot of atheists and a lot of secularists and a lot of academics who want to put that information out there. So, I've read the Quran. I'm not a Muslim. I've heard it in Arabic. I'm not a Muslim. I've read the Bible. I am a Catholic and a Christian. But I also understand that the Bible has errors. There are scientific errors in the Bible. There are manuscript errors in the Bible. There are spelling errors in the Bible. Some historical stuff is not an error, but like some historical stuff is literally flipped around, and the story that's told is not the story that matches the history, but it's still the truth. How does that work? Like that's mind-blowing stuff that theologians debate, and new forms of Christianity are formed over the conclusion you come to. For some people, it's too much of a test and makes them leave their faith when they find out that like the slaughter of the Canaanite people didn't happen. Even though the Bible itself later on says it didn't happen, but because there's one story that says it did happen, that cognitive dissonance just breaks some people's faith. Why would that even be in the Bible? Well, there's a reason. There's a moral to it. There's an overall truth to the Bible. So the Bible is presented as moral truth. The Quran is not presented that way. The Quran assumes that it is the pinnacle of reality, the pinnacle of art, the pinnacle of truth. So for the Quran, there's no other truth but the Quran. For the Bible is speaking about a moral truth, examining the history of a people and the history of a people's belief in God and how that belief changes over time. A lot of Muslims, not all Muslims, because there are several sects of Muslims. There's Shia and Sunni and all this other stuff, and all these other kinds of Muslim. But there are particular Muslims who are Quran onlyist. They're not really the big branch, the big umbrella. But then there's a lot of other stuff you need to know, like Hadith. So I read a lot of Hadith when I was reading the Quran, and believe me, it's a lot of stuff. And Nadir didn't want to go to the Hadith. Apostate Prophet opened by talking about the Hadith, which I think was a mistake. It was a tactical. Should have stuck with the Quran and gone through it from there. But to say that the Quran can't be translated is foolishness. You can definitely understand what it's saying through translations. You might want to get 2 or 3 translations. You might want to get an official translation or a well-respected translation, one from each sect, so that you can kind of see the biases in the way they're translating. But that still will give you a broad picture and a good picture of what the Quran is trying to say. If I was a Muslim, what would this video do? This debate would piss me off. As a Catholic and a Christian who believes the Bible, and yeah, this debate doesn't do anything for me. And I'm pretty sure that if you're an atheist watching this video, this does nothing but confirm your bias against religion already. So I think this debate was a horrible failure, especially for Nadir Ahmed. And I don't think this this debate was a success for the Apostate Prophet either. Because all it's going to do is confirm to his audience, who his audience, let's remind you, is going to be atheists and then Christians who already have a bias against the Quran. All this is confirming what they already think about Muslim apologists and what they already think about the Quran, which is a shame, because even though for me personally the Quran didn't really work for me as a work of art, it isn't something that I found particularly amazing, it still is a very important book. It has tremendous impact through most of the world, and to ignore it and to not want to read it or to denigrate it just because you don't agree with it is a mistake. I think everyone who's not a Muslim should definitely read the Quran. Okay? If you're not a Muslim, you need to read the Quran. You need to understand who you're talking to and what they believe and what their history is and how they view you and why they view those things and why they think those things. Because if you don't have any of that cultural context, you won't understand some of the interactions that you're having. Now, that doesn't mean that I think you should believe the Quran, because I'm going to go with the Bible over the Quran. I'm going to take what I believe, and I'm going to use it to look at what science says, and I'm going to be like, okay, morally and ethically, what should I do based on what the Bible says? I think a more interesting comment or a more interesting debate would be debating the ethics of the Quran versus the ethics that come out of the Bible. Because the Bible has a broad range of moral ethics that when you get all the way to Revelations, trickles down to just a few very basic rules. You know, that's a very interesting process. And to debate what applies to today's society that's an interesting debate. And then to have that debate, have that argument with someone who's a Muslim or someone who's a very staunch believer in the Quran, that's an interesting debate. This debate, on the other hand, talking about whether or not there are scientific errors in the Quran and having the person saying that there isn't any scientific errors in the Quran say, unlike the Bible, which has scientific errors, which he says that the Quran corrects. No, the Bible is not a scientific book, and it's not claiming to be a scientific book. It's also not claiming to be a math book. There are some history books in there, but it's also not claiming to be a history book. There are several books there that deal with history, but for the most part, it's metaphor, analogy, morals, ethics, polemics, prayer, liturgy. I mean, the Bible consists of many, many, many different style of books. Because it's a collection, it's a library. That's what canon is, it's a library. The Quran is one single book, one single point of view that has one single message. That's a very different thing than the Bible, which has many points of view and many, many different morals. So the two don't really match up that well. It's one of the things that doesn't get addressed here, because every time that the Apostate Prophet wants to push the conversation forward, Nadir would pull the conversation back to these anti-biblical, anti-Christian talking points. Because he has a problem with David Wood and other people involved in different productions that David Wood does. And this is exactly what James White talked about when he went after David Wood. He was just slinging trash the whole time before the debate, and he was in the videos leading up to that debate, it was just him slinging trash, and he was talking so much garbage about the Quran that even if what he was saying was true, it was so disrespectful that now it's giving these debaters license in their minds to be jerks to all Christians and atheists that they debate. As someone who enjoys the Apostate Prophet, this debate did not show off the intelligence and the abilities of the Apostate Prophet, which is a shame, because he had a follow-up video that really did highlight his talking points. And I wish that video had been this debate, where he got to speak his thoughts in full. That being said, this debate did nothing for the Quran, did nothing for Nadir Ahmed at all. He came off looking like a jerk and arrogant. Makes people who are going to practice Muslim apologetics look like jerks. It wasn't a good picture. There is a time for that. There is a time when you need to speak to your audience and you need to raise up some fervor. This wasn't it. And even though he was trying to insert humor and trying to keep it light while still pushing back, he didn't do a good job of controlling himself. And that's the only winner to me in this debate was Amun. When it comes to the debate on whether or not there are scientific errors in the Quran, I don't think the Quran should be read as a scientific book. So I don't think those scientific errors are relevant to its theology or morality. That being said, at the end of the day, I'm a Christian and a Catholic. I'm going to go with the Bible over the Quran. But that's just, I don't think this debate should have shaken anyone's faith, and I seriously doubt it did. But I do think that this debate did most definitely feed into and reinforce any preconceptions or any biases that any Christian or atheist that was watching this debate or will watch this debate has. Because Nadir came off condescending and he got caught up on points that don't matter when it comes to faith or morals. I would have to say that the only winner in this debate was Amun Ra, who came off looking great as a moderator and really self-controlled and self-assured. The Apostate Prophet had a really great follow-up video, which I do recommend watching. But in this debate, I don't think either Apostate Prophet or Nadir came off looking too great, although Nadir did look worse for wear simply because he was the one being the bigger jerk. For me, when it comes to what Nadir wanted to say, which is that the Bible is making claims about science and history, the Bible is not a science book. There's no science in there, and I'm pretty sure it has scientific errors because it does have historical errors, quote-unquote errors. It does have metaphor and analogy. It does actually take history and change certain stories to be polemic. It does that. It has narrative. It has poetry, analogy. So, you know, there are some books in the Bible that are history, but not all of them are. In fact, most of them are not. And then it does have biographies that are called lives, which we call the Gospels. And it does have letters. So, I mean, it does have historical stuff in there, but not everything in there is historical. Anyway, so this debate didn't move me one way or the other. Does the Quran contain scientific errors? Yeah, it kind of has to, because science has scientific errors. So if it's agreeing 100% with science today, what about science from 100 years ago? What about science from 100 years from now? It doesn't make a lot of sense to tie itself that far into current science and current developments and current discoveries. As a Catholic, there's a great saying about the Old Testament when it comes to the Genesis story, which is Catholics are allowed to take it literal if they want to, but they don't have to. And they can also believe in evolution and the Big Bang Theory if they want to, but they don't have to. To be a good Catholic, you don't have to believe in the Big Bang Theory. So peace, like, and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great night, and talk to you all later.